My son looked straight into my eyes. His voice was cold, like it had been rehearsed for a long time. "You are no longer my parents." Those words landed just minutes before his wedding ceremony was about to begin. I stood in the carpeted hallway, thick and quiet, holding the wedding gift envelope still damp with sweat. And in that moment I understood something clearly. I had just been pushed out of the life of the child I had raised for 30 years. Outside, guests were laughing. Cameras were flashing. Life was moving forward as planned. And me, for the first time in my life, I was being asked to leave in silence. Before I continue with what happened that day, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment where you are listening to this story. Your support helps real family stories like this continue to be told. And now, back to that moment. I was still standing there, the envelope in my hand, and the door behind my son slowly began to close. I didn't say anything after that. I stood still for a few seconds, long enough to realize that the wooden door behind my son wasn't just closing a room. It was closing a relationship. He adjusted his tie, avoided my eyes, then gestured toward a man in a black suit standing at the end of the hallway. I understood right away. In this place, I had become someone who was not invited. Alice was standing behind me. She didn't hear every word, but she understood by the way Harrison never turned back. She placed her hand on my arm very gently, as if she was afraid of breaking something that was already cracked. I heard her whisper our son's name, but the music from the main hall drowned it out. We had driven almost 10 hours to get here, left our small town before sunrise. Alice packed food because she didn't want us wasting money at roadside stops. She wore a light blue dress, carefully fixing every seam herself the night before. She said she wanted to look neat on her son's big day. I didn't say it out loud, but I had seen her nervousness from the moment she locked the front door. The estate where the wedding was held stood apart from everything else. Tall iron gates, lawns trimmed so evenly they didn't look real. Shiny cars lined up, one after another, drivers opening doors like it was a ritual. Alice and I parked on our own and walked down a long gravel path. No one greeted us. I told myself it was just because we arrived early. In the waiting room, I saw my son's name engraved on a polished brass plaque, Harrison Blackwood. Below it was Victoria's name in a more decorative font. I almost told him the sign felt a bit excessive, but I stayed quiet. A wedding day isn't the time for lessons. Until my son stepped out, stood in front of me, and said something I never thought I would hear in my lifetime. After that, everything moved very fast and very slow at the same time. The man in the black suit stepped closer. He didn't touch us. He didn't need to. He stood close enough to apply pressure. Harrison lowered his head and added a few words about image, about appropriate guests, about how Victoria didn't want any off-tone elements today. He chose his words carefully, like a lawyer picking phrases to avoid responsibility. Alice took a step forward. She held out the envelope, her hand trembling slightly. She said it was just a blessing, no need to open it. Harrison didn't take it. His eyes passed over the envelope and looked away, as if it didn't belong to him. That was when Victoria appeared. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She smiled. The kind of smile worn by people who believe they are exactly where they should be. She looked Alice up and down, pausing a little too long at the old shoes Alice had worn for years. Then she took the card from Alice's hand and tore it cleanly in half, like ripping scrap paper. She said this was a ceremony for people who met proper standards, that things brought from a local grocery store didn't belong here. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for me to hear every word. I looked at Harrison. My son stood still. No protest. No explanation. He didn't look at his mother. I placed my hand on Alice's shoulder and gently pulled her back. I knew if she spoke again, she would cry, and I didn't want her tears to become decoration for someone else's wedding. We turned around. No one stopped us, maybe because in their plan our exit had already been accounted for. The hallway felt longer than when we arrived. The music behind us grew thicker, swallowing every other sound. When the large doors closed, I heard applause. Outside, the sun was harsh. Alice stood still, looking toward the garden where the ceremony was about to begin. I saw her shoulders tremble slightly. I said we should go. She nodded, very slowly. We didn't drive straight home. I pulled off the road and stopped at a fast food place. Not because we were hungry, but because I needed somewhere to sit. Alice held a cup of water and stared at the tabletop. She apologized to me, saying maybe we had done something wrong long ago. I didn't answer. Some questions shouldn't be asked at moments like this. I opened the old laptop I always keep in the trunk, a habit from my working years. Alice looked at me a little surprised. She asked what I was doing. I said I was just checking a few things. The truth was, I had already made a very clear decision in my mind, even though I hadn't said it out loud yet. My son's wedding ended without us appearing in a single photograph. But to me, it wasn't just rejection. It was a signal. And I learned long ago that when someone deliberately shuts a door in your face, what you need to do is not knock harder, but step back and see who is truly controlling the house. We sat in that fast food place for a long time, too long for lunch, too short to call it rest. The smell of hot oil and the hum of the coffee machine blended into a steady layer of sound, just enough to cover the space opening up between my wife and me. Alice didn't eat. She turned the paper cup slowly in her hands, watching the ice melt. I knew she was trying to stay calm, the same way she used to when former students came to visit and confessed where they had failed in life. I opened the laptop. The screen lit up slowly, like an old man needing time to stand. Alice asked what I was looking for. I said I wasn't looking, just checking. The truth was, I was rearranging things I hadn't touched in years, not because I forgot, but because I chose silence. Harrison grew up in our small house, where everything lasted longer than it should have. I drove him to school in an old car. I taught him the difference between the value of effort and the value of money. When he asked why we didn't live like other families, I said everyone makes their own choices. I didn't say that I was choosing to hide. Blackwood Estate was never a name I spoke out loud. It existed before I was born, built on careful decisions and patient years by those before me. When it was passed to me, I signed a stack of papers and locked them in a safe. I kept control, but gave up the habit of display. I wanted my son to grow up without leaning on a shadow. Alice knew part of it. She knew we were comfortable, but she didn't know the scale. I never told her. I thought it wasn't necessary. Some secrets don't exist to deceive, but to protect a way of living. On the screen, everything was clear. The trust was running steadily. The assets were still under the family company. One line made me pause longer. The penthouse in downtown Chicago, where Harrison and Victoria were living, was listed as part of the very group I controlled. I wasn't surprised. I only noticed how that coincidence arrived at exactly the right moment. Alice looked at me and saw the change in my face. She asked if something was wrong. I said everything was fine, and it was. For the first time that day, I felt steady on my feet. Harrison never asked me about money. He asked about connections, about opportunities, about how to be recognized. Victoria was different. The first time we met, she asked what I did, how long I'd been retired, and whether I invested. I answered briefly. She nodded, as if placing me into a mental drawer. I remembered Victoria's eyes when she tore the card in half. That wasn't impulse. That was certainty. She believed she stood above, and that from above you have the right to remove what doesn't fit. I'd met people like that in my career. They often confuse their current position with real power. I started reviewing old files, old connections I had left untouched. Not to react, but to understand. I wanted to know what had changed Harrison so quickly. My son wasn't someone who cut ties easily. Something had been placed in his mind piece by piece, enough to make him believe his parents were a burden. Alice finally took a bite of her sandwich. She said, "Maybe we should head home early." I nodded, but didn't shut the laptop. I saved a few things, sent them to myself. Old habits. Back when I worked as an inspector, I learned never to ignore small details. They often lead to very large doors. On the drive back, Alice fell asleep. She was exhausted. I drove along familiar roads, thinking about the years behind us. I didn't feel angry. I felt regret. Regret for a child who chose to cut his roots in order to stand higher. Regret for a wedding day that should have been a beginning, but became a pause. That night, when we got home, I opened the safe. The documents were still there, neat, silent. I didn't feel like I was preparing to do something drastic. I just knew I couldn't keep standing outside anymore, not to punish, but to put things back where they belonged. I closed the safe and turned off the light in my study. Alice asked if I was okay. I said I was. And this time, I believed it. Because when the truth is hidden for too long, it doesn't disappear. It just waits to be faced. And I knew that day had begun. The moment my son turned his back on me in that thick carpeted hallway in Chicago. I didn't start by confronting my son. I knew that if I did, everything would slide in another direction, one where emotions took control and the truth became distorted. Instead, I did what I had done for years in my work. I observed, I gathered, and I waited for the picture to reveal itself. In the days after the wedding, Harrison didn't call. Alice didn't reach out either. She was afraid, not of our son, but of making things worse. I respected that silence, but I didn't stay still. I began with the smallest things. Harrison's work schedule, the professional connections he had mentioned in past conversations, names that kept coming up, names I hadn't paid attention to before. I didn't need help. I only needed time. Victoria appeared at almost every intersection. She was present at partner meetings, at social events, in carefully arranged posts online. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. I had learned that when someone controls their image too tightly, they are usually hiding something that doesn't sit right. I followed an old connection, someone I had worked with before retirement. Not to ask for favors, just to ask questions. The answer came slowly, but it was clear. Victoria had her own schedule separate from her husband. She was meeting an older man, someone with influence in the field Harrison was trying to break into. That man also happened to be the largest partner of Harrison's company. I didn't rush to conclusions. I checked again, then again, and a third time. What emerged wasn't a personal mistake. It was a chain of deliberate choices. Victoria was building an exit for herself, while placing Harrison out front to absorb the risk. Documents, vague clauses, signatures placed in the right spots, at the wrong time. My son isn't foolish, but he is trusting the wrong person. What hurt me the most wasn't the betrayal between a young couple. It was the way Victoria planted doubt in Harrison's mind about his own parents. I read messages sent in a very familiar tone. Concern on the surface, protection pretended, and then careful guidance. She told him that Alice and I didn't support him, that we were holding him back, that we might even side with competitors, just to keep him small. Harrison believed it. Not completely, but enough to pull away, enough to turn his back in that hallway. I sat alone in my study, staring at the lines on the screen. I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, empty space, where trust used to live. Alice came in with a cup of tea. She asked if I had found anything. I said yes, but it wasn't time to say everything. She didn't ask more. She always knows when to stop. I knew I had two options: expose everything at once and wake my son with a shock, or put things back into position first, so that when the truth surfaced, it wouldn't cause unnecessary collapse. I chose the second path. I started with the debt. Harrison's company was under more financial pressure than he realized. The terms were written to look manageable, but they were a slow trap. I bought those obligations through layers of intermediaries, quietly, legally. No one in Harrison's office knew. No one in Victoria's family noticed. To them, it was just a technical shift. To me, it was a line being drawn. I didn't do this to control my son. I did it to keep him from falling freely when the truth finally arrived. Over the years, I've seen people lose everything, not because of mistakes, but because no one was there to catch them when they trusted the wrong person. When everything was in my hands, I stopped. I didn't move further. I waited. Victoria continued her performance. Harrison kept chasing meetings and promises. Alice sometimes asked if we should tell him the truth. I shook my head. Some lessons can't be taught with words. They have to be seen. That night I didn't sleep much, not from worry, but from weighing every next step. I didn't want to destroy anyone. I only wanted the light turned on. In a room people had grown too comfortable leaving dark. When the sun came up, I knew I was ready, not to strike back, but to end a chain of misunderstandings that had gone too far. I also knew that when the truth is placed on the table, not everyone has the calm to face it, but that was no longer something I could control. I closed the laptop, stood up, and felt my heartbeat settle again. I've lived long enough to understand that justice doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes it only needs to arrive at the right moment. And I was waiting for that moment. The moment came sooner than I expected. A month had passed since the wedding, long enough for the rumors to settle, long enough for the edited photos to be posted, and long enough for Harrison to believe everything was back on the track he wanted. I didn't interfere. I only watched, The charity gala took place on a Saturday night at an old hotel overlooking the river. Alice didn't want to go. She said she didn't belong in places like that. I told her this time we weren't going to belong. We were going to stand where we were supposed to stand. The car stopped at the red carpet. I saw the lights reflecting off the glass, heard the steady rhythm of high heels on stone. Alice held my hand a little tighter. I felt her heartbeat. Familiar, uneasy. I told her softly that we would walk slowly. There was no need to rush. Inside, everything was brighter than necessary. Short conversations, calculated handshakes. I saw Harrison from a distance standing beside Victoria. His suit fit well. His face carried a confidence I hadn't seen before. Victoria tilted her head, smiled at the right moments. She looked like she belonged. We were guided to the section reserved for honorary guests. Alice stopped. She looked at me as if asking whether there had been a mistake. I shook my head. There wasn't. Victoria saw us first. Her expression froze for a brief moment, then smoothed itself out. Harrison followed her gaze. He stood still. I couldn't read his face, only the confusion he was trying to suppress. I didn't walk toward them. I didn't need to. I knew the stage would call my name on its own. When the host began introducing the sponsors, the room gradually quieted. I heard my name spoken aloud. No grand titles, just clear and simple. Alice squeezed my hand. I stood up and walked to the stage, greeted by polite applause. I didn't look down right away. I took a slow breath. I wasn't there to explain myself. I was there to end a chain of misunderstandings. I spoke about the purpose of the evening, about the value of giving without needing recognition. I kept it short, enough to hold attention. Then I shifted my tone, gently, the way you do when speaking about something already decided. I said I had 2 gifts. The first gift, I said, was the release document for the penthouse where my son was living. I didn't look at Harrison, but I knew he was listening. The room stirred softly. I said the debt had been resolved, legally, completely, no extra details. The second gift, I said, was not for my family. It was for transparency. I said that certain documents related to unclear financial activities by several companies had been submitted to the authorities before this evening. I stopped. No names were needed. I looked toward Victoria. She was still standing, but the smile was gone. Harrison turned to his wife as if asking a question. Victoria didn't look back. There was no chaos, no shouting, just a few well-dressed individuals entering quietly, exchanging brief words, then escorting Victoria away in tense silence. The room maintained its politeness, to the point of coldness. Conversations paused, then resumed lower and more cautious. Harrison stood there, unable to keep up with what was happening. He looked at me. For the first time since the wedding, he truly looked. In his eyes, I saw the confusion I had tried to prevent. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't signal. I only nodded slightly, a quiet confirmation that he needed to stay and think. I stepped down from the stage. Alice stood and came toward me. She didn't ask anything. She only said she wanted to go home. I agreed. On the way out, I heard whispers beginning to spread. Unclear, incomplete. I knew that by morning the story would be rewritten in many different ways. That no longer mattered. In the car, Alice asked if I felt lighter. I thought for a moment, then said I felt more aligned. She nodded. That night, Harrison didn't call. I wasn't expecting him to. Some conversations need time before they can exist. When we got home, I opened the door to my study and looked at the safe still closed. I didn't open it again. What needed to be set right had been set. What needed to be brought into the light had been revealed, without harming those who didn't belong in the fallout. I sat down and felt the quiet return. Not the quiet of avoidance, but the quiet that comes after doing what had to be done. I knew that for Harrison the night would be long, and for me, that was unavoidable. I turned off the light and stepped outside where Alice was waiting. I knew the hardest part of the story wasn't over yet, but for the first time since that thick carpeted hallway in Chicago, I believed things were moving toward the truth. Slowly, painfully, but necessarily. Harrison came earlier than I expected. It was still dawn. Mist lay across the front lawn. I was making coffee when I heard a car pull up. Alice stood by the window, looked out, then turned to me. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. My son stood on the porch for a long time before knocking. When I opened the door, he lowered his head, not out of politeness, but because he didn't know where to begin. His face looked thinner than I remembered, as if in a single night he had been forced to look back on his entire life. We sat in the old living room, the same place where Harrison used to lie on the floor, doing homework as a boy. Alice made tea, then quietly stepped into the kitchen. She left the two of us alone, just as she always knows when to do. Harrison knelt down. The gesture made me stand up on instinct. I didn't want him to do that, but he stayed there, saying he was wrong, saying he trusted the wrong person, saying he let someone else define who his parents were. He spoke slowly, brokenly, as if hearing his own words for the first time. I didn't speak right away. I looked at him for a long time. In that moment, I didn't see a lawyer. I didn't see a man chasing the upper world. I only saw a child who had gone too far from where he began. I helped Harrison to his feet. I told him that an apology is not an ending. It's only a beginning. He nodded. Tears fell onto the old wooden floor silently. I handed him a set of keys, not the keys to the penthouse. I told him I had sold it. The money had been transferred to a charitable fund in line with the values his mother and I always believed in. I told him his debt had been resolved. No one was chasing him anymore. But I was very clear about one thing. He was no longer standing on any platform I had built for him. I showed him a small apartment near the city center. Enough to live, enough to start again. I said, I'm not giving you an easy life. I'm giving you a chance to begin again. Harrison gripped the keys tightly as if they were the heaviest thing he had ever held. Alice came back into the living room. She placed her hand on our son's shoulder. She didn't say much, only that she hoped he would be well, and that she hoped he would remember this family is not a place for comparison, but a place to return to when there is nothing left to prove. In the days that followed, Harrison moved out. He didn't ask about money again. He found a new job, smaller, less glamorous. I didn't interfere. I only watched from a distance the way a father should when his child is old enough to take responsibility. Alice and I began a different life. Not richer, not poorer. We went to places we had always wanted to visit but kept postponing. No rush, no display, just living at our own pace. One afternoon, we stood by Lake Michigan. The wind was gentle, the water reflected the sunset. Alice held my hand and asked if I had any regrets. I thought for a moment, then shook my head. I said some losses are necessary to protect values that cannot be replaced. I turned toward the camera, not to speak to anyone in particular, but as if speaking to myself. I said that family is not built on status or money. It is built on respect. When you cut off your roots to reach for the sun, you will soon wither in that very light. The sun sank lower. Alice and I stood there, saying nothing more. Our story didn't end with punishment. It ended with understanding. And for me, that was a good enough ending. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If it made you reflect on family, on respect, and on the boundaries that matter, please like, subscribe, and share so more people can have a chance to listen. Every bit of support helps real stories like this continue to be told. The message I want to leave you with is simple. Family is not a place to display success, but the place where we learn how to be human before we learn how to succeed.